Hello and welcome to this video on the political tensions and Republican dominance in the period from 1890 onwards. We're going to look at the turmoil of this period. We're going to revise some of the reactions against big business. We're going to look at how the Populist Party and William Jennings Bryan come about, how much success do they have, and whether he really was an influential figure in this period. So a little bit of revision is first needed. Obviously, we talked about previously the election of Cleveland, the reaction to electing Harrison in 1890, and then the return of Cleveland again before we look at McKinley. Then in later lessons we'll look at Roosevelt, Taft, and finally the Progressive under Wilson. The situation in 1890, at the end of the presidency of Grover Cleveland, we see some of the reaction against big business through the election of Benjamin Harrison. The reaction, stems from the problems of the Granger movement, Knights of Labour, and the AFL. We can see that there is a group of individuals that are against the status quo, against the existence of big business, against the dominance of a few individuals over many the individuals. By 1880s, we've got the reaction of 27 states passing laws to curb the cartels and trusts' influence. 1887 Interstate Commerce Commission is the first time the federal government is regulating travel on railroads, and we've got in 1890 the Sherman Antitrust Act. All of these are pieces of legislation that's aimed at regulating big business. Now, in this period of 1890 to about 1900, we've got the growth in a movement, the Populist Movement, and it leads to the creation of a new political party, and it gets predominant amount of support from the South and the West in the USA. It's spurned on by the Depression in 1893, it bankrupts many businesses, and it forces people to seek out an alternative, and they turn towards populism as one way in which to do that. We've also got a growing anger towards the gold standard, and that manifests in the silver and bimetallists. They want to abandon the gold standard, and they want to use silver as a means of currency. It's a much more complex reason than I've just gone into, and it's supported by many people in the West. And lastly, we've got agricultural discontent. Now, there's huge amounts of competition from Europe with cheap grain from Russia, etc., and that leads to massive amounts of price falls in wheat and cotton, which is the predominant good and farming of the South. So therefore we see a lot of anger in the West and the South, and they turn towards populism. So what is populism? It was formed in 1892 in Omaha. It fought the election of 1892 and it won 1 million votes. It therefore has a huge influence in politics in this period, and in 1896 they get to elect and hugely influence the Democratic nomination. Their aims are to regulate the railroads. They want government regulation of farm prices. They want to move to a graduated income tax rather than tariffs as a means for the government to generate income. So what that means is that the most wealthy in society will pay more than the poorest in society, very similar to the tax system that we have currently in England. And they want the direct election of senators to represent them. They want 2 senators elected for every state. Again, sounds familiar because that's exactly the system that was put in place at a later date. They want a maximum 8-hour working day, and they want to alter the basis of currency, as we've mentioned, from the gold standard to an alternative. They want to adopt silver as an additional currency. They have a huge amount of influence, and they choose William Jennings Bryan to be the candidate that's going to stand in the election in 1896. He's a lawyer from Illinois. He's elected to the House of Representatives in 1890. He's the youngest person ever to be nominated by his party to represent them in an election. He's a fundamentalist Christian, he's a pacifist, he's an anti-imperialist, and he's a believer in free silver. This is a very popular candidate, but he loses the election. He loses it. 273 seats goes to McKinley, 176 to Bryan. We're going to look at why he loses them. The Populist Party never recovered after this. By 1900, membership had fallen. Activists had either retired or they'd joined other parties. But it did have some significant improvement, significant advances. The Progressives, that we're going to talk about in much later episodes, adopt many of the ideas of the Populist Party. They do have some success in this period from 1890 to 1900. They elect 11 governors. 45 members of its party serve in US Congress. Now, we've got to compare the rise of populism to the rise of the Republican Party. The Republican Party, after they win the election of 1896, are going to go on to dominate the elections until Roosevelt's elected in 1912, but it's going to be a very short-lived Democrat election and win. Now, in 1890, the Republican Party is a very different party from the Reconstruction Party of Lincoln. It has fewer African American voters after Reconstruction failed. The South was a lost cause. They were never going to win in the southern states. They're a party of high tariffs and protectionist economics. That means that you're going to pay huge amounts if you want non-American goods, so you buy American, and if you want to sell your goods abroad, you're going to have to pay high tariffs as well. Democrats were divided at the same time. We've got the Eastern Conservatives, very lukewarm towards Bryan. They supported Cleveland beforehand, and Bryan has a very unorthodox approach. Now, the Republican Party in 1896 is supported by Mark Hanna. He spends $7 million to elect McKinley, whereas Jennings Bryan goes around the country over thousands of miles of tours and speaks to millions of people in rallies. McKinley spends huge amounts of money in key states, and he slanders his opponent, and he wins the election in a move that we wouldn't really see too dissimilar from that of the elections today. Now, McKinley is a president that we can sort of see some of the tension building and the reaction to big business. The Republicans had won the presidency, the House and the Senate with large majorities. They didn't need the black vote in the South, and that's going to be hugely influential for their politics of the future. If they don't have to appeal to the African Americans and the sharecroppers, then they're going to change their politics and they're going to aim towards big business, and we're going to see the reaction in the progressive movement later on. The Democrats are hugely weakened by internal divisions. Populism is fading away by this period, and the economy is about to enter a period of growth. All of these are very beneficial towards the presidency of McKinley, and we see him pass legislation that's in favour of big business. We've got the Dingley Tariff Act of 1897. We've got the Alaskan Yukon gold rush. That means there's more gold in circulation, so people start to abandon the idea of moving towards silver. We've got the 1900 Currency Act that commits the US to that. And we've got the euphoria from the Spanish-American War. It's an increased amount of nationalism in this period that means McKinley is very popular. He also chooses Theodore Roosevelt to stand as his vice president, and he defeats Bryan in the election of 1900. And it means that he's going to have a very long period of dominance as president until he's assassinated in 1901 by a Polish-German anarchist, Leon Kogolsk. Now, we can see in this period from 1896 to 1900, 1901, how much the Republicans dominate. They are the party of big business, and we can see how big business again is going to survive the scare of the populist movement and start to dominate politics. But populism doesn't go away. Populism leads to progressivism, and there's going to be this people's movement that's against big business, against this spoils system, against all of the problems that still exist in American politics, and we're going to see that start to come about under the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, who as vice president becomes the youngest ever president at 42 years old, and he's going to lead a new period of politics up until the election of Taft, and then with Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson later on. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.